Hi, Marie.
Hi.
Thanks for joining me and telling me about the stuff you've been looking into.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
You recently wrote a master's thesis about female innovation in rural areas.
Yeah.
What was the reason that you found that to be an interesting take on the subject?
Yeah, I did a semester in the Westfjords of Iceland. And was like my last semester of my master's program, and I was in the process of where to write my thesis and what to write about. And my master's program is called Cities and Sustainability. But then when I was in Iceberg, I joined the program called Coastal Communities and Regional Development. So I was thinking about a spin on both sustainable cities, but also resilient communities, which is kind of like similar but different, especially when we talk about the communities in the Westfjords, because they're comparably small and quite remote and not that easy to access. Yeah, and I was looking at different things. I have a background in environmental science. I was looking at these things, and then I had some courses on regional development. We talked a lot about innovation in these courses and how innovation can help communities to be resilient, to grow, to maybe attract new citizens and stuff. And then I decided to write about innovation in rural communities. But then looking deeper into the topic, I realized that especially as these fishing communities in the Westfjords are resource-dependent communities, this resource dependence is very male-oriented. And therefore, when we talk about classical innovation in these communities, it tends to be male-oriented too, because that's the main workforce in this main industry. Of course, all the women are working too, but the main interest is in fisheries and innovation in that field. And I thought there's no difference on being innovative between men and women, but there might be, due to different life circumstances, differences regarding topics on where they're innovative and also approaches on how to be innovative. And that led me to looking or comparing the innovativeness of that region with some feminist theories. I chose ecofeminism to look at that, because that's interesting to look at in resource-dependent communities, because ecofeminism says that exploiting the nature also means exploiting the women. That's a pretty harsh argument, but I use that as a lens and also to argue that I'm just looking at women and not just and not both men and women. Yeah.
Okay. So can you tell me a little bit more about how you perceived to be the different sort of modes of innovation between men and women in resource-dependent communities like the Westfjords?
Well, I have to say that I didn't look at the innovativeness of men, so I cannot say that much about that. So of course, men are innovative too, and there might be actually that might be interwoven in some way. But let's say the theoretical background that I used is earlier studies about innovation in rural and resource-dependent communities that says that women are still living under more, let's call them traditional roles, as experiencing a more traditional lifestyle of being house women, taking care of the household, having a higher mental load when it comes to taking care of the family. They might also be in charge of earning money, but historically, at least, that nowadays that might be different. But historically, the man or the husband was responsible of earning the money, and the women were responsible of taking care and managing the household. And that leads to a difference in the topics that women are more, especially in fishing communities, connected to the community because they spend the whole time on land, whereas men were historically going out fishing. That's changed, but like I'm talking about the historical background. And then also women had a different and still have a different time frame of being responsible for the children and the upbringing, and therefore having different time slots. They cannot necessarily join meetings as people who don't have children, or and as some women told me, I mean, that it sounds very, very traditional, very conservative, but as some women told me, that is how they experience living in these communities in the Westfjords, that they feel to be expected to stay at home and take care of the children. So I'm just, that's not my opinion, it's what some women told me. And of course there are differences, and I just talked to 8 women, so I cannot put words into their mouth. But the women that I talked to, they felt that this, that mental load and the time that they have to spend to organize their family holds them back on being innovative. Right.
So so it's a similar discussion as we have had in feminist circles with this caretaking role within the family, and also emotional labor, right? Or like
exactly,
that innovation requires you to have a lot of time and space to be able to engage in it. So this could be sort of something that could limit the potential for women to participate in innovation. You also, in your thesis, you kind of explore a potential to kind of think about innovation differently. I mean, or kind of broaden what it is that innovation is, or is conceived as. Can you tell me a bit about that? Like, it does kind of looking at innovation from a female perspective help us to understand innovation more holistically?
Yeah. So I started with defining what innovation means, and I looked into different papers and definitions, and there is a very classical it's not necessarily definition or something, but that's how it's used in like everyday language. Innovation always brings up images of technology and something new, groundbreaking, things that change the world. And I combined, it's not just about women, it's also about this, like, that I looked into remote communities, that innovation has to be seen bigger and more holistic. In just, I define innovation as the creative process of coming up with solutions for problems. And problems in remote communities, and also for women in more traditional remote communities, are maybe globally seen smaller, but they're still problems that need solutions. And an innovation in a rural community can be just something that, like, it is harder to approach everyday challenges in remote communities. To find a solution for an everyday challenge is already an innovation in remote communities. And it is about, like, making things work that might not just work naturally in a community because it's too small or because it's too remote. And then another thing is that I put a big focus on that an innovation doesn't have to have a financial outcome or an, like, very traditional capitalistic goal of growth and revenue, but an innovation is just a creative solution. So, and that also, there's quite some studies and research about that female innovation focuses less on that economic part, but more on that social and communal way of finding solutions together. which I find, especially like when we look at global problems nowadays, when it comes to the climate crisis and stuff, that is actually so important that, and I feel like in international research there's not enough focus on that. I like to point out that paper. Unfortunately, I don't know the author right now, but there's a paper from the Netherlands where actually a team of female researchers looked at rural communities and innovation there, and they call this female innovation, they call it side activities, which I find so unfair, because this so-called side activities are something that keep the community running and that brings so much value to these communities, but not financial value. And
Go on. No, I those are two things that you've brought up, which I find very interesting. There are kind of two disruption on the innovation concept as we think about it. One is to say innovation in rural areas doesn't have to be inventing something completely new. And the second is the object of innovation doesn't have to be sort of financial or in a market context, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Well, and maybe like you were pointing out that we are creating a kind of a hierarchy where we call the things that are not fetching a market price side innovation.
Yeah.
The name of your thesis refers to an iceberg.
Yeah.
And there is an interesting picture of an iceberg a figure that you use.
Yeah.
I can probably put it on the screen for the viewers.
Yeah, that would be cool.
But maybe you can, tell us a bit about what that conveys to us. So I'm looking at an iceberg, and everybody knows that just a part of the iceberg is on the surface. And on the surface, we've got wage, labor, commodity markets, and capitalist enterprise, right?
Yeah.
And then on the bottom, we have what you were criticizing as being like the side activities, no?
Yeah.
We have soil, nutrition, do-it-yourself, language, informal loans, open source, family, libraries, fundraising, hunting. So it's sort of like, by looking at it from a female point of view, we're also doing like a critique of kind of economic discourse, right? Like that value is to be found in something that fetches a price and not in something that kind of impacts the society.
Yeah, I think I scratch upon that topic, but it's a big capitalistic critique actually. When it comes to rural innovation, that to keep rural and remote communities alive, there's so much more happening that need, especially in these remote communities in Iceland, need to work without direct, for example, governmental intervention. And there is this big thing in these communities in the Westfjords, that's fishing, and that's such a big thing with everyone that I talk to. It is so important, and of course it's the main economic driver. But I use this model. It's the Iceberg model of diverse economies from Gibson Graham, and that shows that this like top of the iceberg is what we see and what is valued nationally and in the capitalist society. But even the capitalist society just works because of all this like invisible things that are underwater in that model, and which is in traditional resource-dependent communities mainly carried out by women, because men are doing this like hard labor in like mining communities or fishing communities and so on. So I try to point out that all these activities and innovation that the women do every day that I interviewed, I tried to point out that they are as my thesis is called, the keel of the iceberg, that they have the same importance for the communities, but they're just nationally, like, I think within the communities that's actually pretty valued, that everyone knows that every person in this community is contributing in their own way. But just on a national or even global level, these activities are not valued enough.
Yeah, I think it's there are so many examples from rural communities, probably bigger communities as well, but like, let's for instance say if a group of volunteers builds a community hall, and if some volunteers also keep that community hall going, clean it after each event and so forth, and it's never rented out for a market value, then the value of that community hall in, from an economic perspective, from a kind of narrow economic perspective is zero. But the actual value being created is huge, even if it just doesn't ever fetch a price in the same sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
So maybe innovation is kind of a little bit the concept of innovation isn't looking enough at the stuff that's not being recorded by the economy.
Yeah. And I mean, we have that term of social innovation that tries to capture enterprises that do not have economical growth as the main objective. But for me, it was still too much focusing on that word enterprise and being like an economical organization, even though economic growth is not the main goal. But with my focus on this like broader definition on innovation, I also wanted to capture just single individuals that are changing the everyday life in a small community just on their own by contributing with their ideas, not necessarily as an organization, just like, or maybe just an initiative, or like sports clubs, for example, can be innovative as well, but they're not an economic organization necessarily.
Right. Yes, if somebody found a new type of a gym in a city, they will be seen as sort of entrepreneurs. And you'll have this gym or this new type of yoga or something all over the place with like branches in every neighborhood. Nobody would blink to call it perhaps innovation if it was doing something differently or new. But if somebody would find a way to organize on a more community voluntary basis, like the way to run sports in a small community, it's a lot less likely to be perceived as being entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
Something like that.
I found like there are like music schools, as I found out or discovered, are a very big thing in Iceland, but not every community has a music school. But it is important for the children and the young people to get to the classes. But in the Westfjords, we have some public transportation, but not in the intervals that you can actually tell your child, take the bus to the next town to go to the music school. So parents come up with systems of bringing their children to music school. And a lot of people who hear this might say like, that's not an innovation, that's just like some parents organizing a driving service. But I think in that it is something that needs to be organized, that needs someone that leads this this project and someone keeping an eye on that. And people might say that's an everyday work for a parent, but it is so essential in remote communities because there's no other option to bring your child to music school except for organizing a driving service within yourself. So.
Right. Well, I mean, are we maybe at a risk of defining innovation in such broad terms that it just means anything to be resourceful or creative? I mean, where does the I mean, I know that you weren't tackling this subject in your thesis, so it's just an open question. Like, where does something stop? Where the definition of innovative and just being resourceful, where does the limit lie? I suppose.
I think it. I don't want to like. I just want to. I think with my thesis and with my example of the organized driving services, that I want to point out that in very remote communities with very defined gender roles, problems and issues, challenges whatsoever are not as easy to be tackled as in urban centers. And one could say that's a very like that is not innovation, but I think it is very context dependent. What innovation can mean, as you said, in an urban center, a new sports club is not an innovation, but keeping something running in a remote community, and there it's not the idea itself of a driving service. It's the way of the innovation there is actually to keep it running and to manage harsh weather events, bad driving conditions, very traditional gender roles of men being maybe out for work even on the weekends, or so I think it is very one might fall into the trap of calling everything innovation, but I think we need to look at, and that's what I try to point out, and we need to look at rural and remote communities differently, with a different focus. It's not the goal, like not the outcome is the innovation, but the way to get to the outcome might be the innovation in remote communities.
Exactly. So it is the second way in which you were challenging the concept of innovation in the essay, which is the first one was this thing about what fetches a price, and the second one was like you're saying that in rural places, to find a new way to deliver something that is being delivered in a big place is innovative, can be innovative.
Yeah.
So I guess not being conscious of this might kind of lead us to believing that rural regions, or women for that matter, are less innovative than men.
Exactly, because they don't come up with maybe a groundbreaking new product, but they find ways to make things work that might not just work on their own.
Right.
And there might be actually pretty intrinsic motivations of coming up with a solution for something that's bothering themselves or that's hindering their own development. And I'm not just talking about family, I'm also talking about, for example, education. When you are living in a small community, you don't have access to the same amount or variety of education opportunities. So I think it is more, it is intrinsic motivation. It's motivation for the community, just offering something that community doesn't have, and not coming up with this like big new thing that makes this community unique. It's just coming up with something the community needs.
Right, because the scope of what is kind of missing is so much greater than in a big place. So, I wonder what, and again, it's an open question, it's not something you wrote about, but I do wonder what that means when we start to evaluate innovation. And I mean, it doesn't mean that innovation needs to be supported in different ways in rural places than in the city. So one context that I have is, like, we've been looking at in our project the grants that go into innovation and how they are 90% of them go to innovation in and around the capital area. And it might be that the reason for that is that innovation is defined in these terms that you're saying, that doesn't include the innovation that's happening in the in the rural ones.
Yeah.
And then the next question, is that a problem? Are we perhaps content with the new groundbreaking innovation happening in the urban ones and the rural ones sort of more in the sense of catching up to the urban with their resourcefulness?
I mean, we also have these groundbreaking innovations happening in the rural. It's not that they just happen in the urban. We also have this happening in very rural places, and I think that they just catch less grants or funding. Might also be just a difference in their lifestyle, and maybe the accessibility of grants, the ability on filling out all these forms, finding the time, finding the right words. When one already worked with all these like grants and funding forms, we know that they are looking for certain buzzwords, and if you are living a different reality because you live in a very rural community, you might not be aware that these buzzwords are actually important, and so I've seen in the Westfjords there's a lot of support if people want to apply for funding. There is actually a lot of support of like organizations that help you fill out these forms and getting these grants, and I found that very surprising. But I think the issue with these innovation grants is more that there's not necessarily that their definition of innovation is too tight when it comes to find like they don't necessarily ask for something new, but they also ask very often for a business plan. And as I said, one of the definitions for innovation is that, in my thesis, is that it doesn't have to have revenue, for example. Then your idea might be great, but you still don't get funding because you will not. You won't grow as an economic enterprise.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is the principal sort of a fund is the regional development funds. Is something that if you had an idea in the Westfjords you would apply to, and the criteria for it to be innovative is certainly a lot lower than if you would apply for a national grant like the Technology Development Fund or so forth. However, and this is just roughly speaking, one single grant for a technology development fund type project is similar to the whole fund of the Westfjords.
Exactly.
So it's also kind of the proportions here, like how do we divide the proportions is another question.
But I think that is actually one of the reasons why people become innovative in the Westfjords, is because this feeling of neglect regarding the government. It's not that many people, so the government doesn't have this big of a they don't have a focus on the Westfjords. But then people in the Westfjords are also might have this like thought of like, whatever, I'm just doing it by myself. I'm just coming up with a solution on my own instead of waiting for the government to do something. And also coming up with their own funding ideas. When we look at, which I find very impressive as a foreigner, when we look at the search and rescue teams, they come up with ways of collecting donations. And I've seen that with other initiatives as well. So they are able to show we're doing something for the community, and the community is willing to directly support these approaches.
Yeah. So in the so to kind of finalize this talk. You mentioned that you had been, before going to the Westfjords to do a semester there studying, you had been working with cities and the concept of sustainable cities, or what was the concepts you were working with? So I guess what I'm curious on a personal level, how did that experience in the Westfjords affect your thinking around cities and rural places, and what was the most sort of influential for you?
Yeah. So for me, to give a little insight, the program that I studied is an engineering program called Cities and Sustainability, and it is looking into concepts and ways to tackle climate change in the urban areas. So it is engineering solutions, but also urban planning and participation of citizens and so on. Also governance theories and such. So first of all, the program helped me to see more of the people side, to actually understand what the people in the communities want and need, because when you look at cities, it's such a big group of people you're working with, and we as planners, or as I studied, it is an urban planning program. We like to know it better and let people participate, but actually already have a very certain goal in mind that we want to achieve, and we want the people that participate in our participation processes to understand what we want and then want it as well. And what I understood now, coming to smaller communities, and I'm also from a big city, so it was also for me personally new to live in such a small community, that it is so much more important to understand what the people they think they want and need, instead of just coming with the concepts and put them on top. Which now coming back, it is a big difference on working on cities, because cities have such the impact of cities globally seen as so much bigger, and changes within the city are affecting so much more people at once, instead of like when you work in a community. But yeah, in smaller communities, I realized it's so much more important to have the people on your side and to understand, and don't come in there with all your, like, I don't know, Central European urban theories and tell them what they need and what they should have. But they know, they've lived there forever and for many years already, and they built up these places, and they came up with their own solutions to challenges that they were facing. So it is, yeah, my thesis was actually way more listening to people, what they're doing and what they think they need, than actually coming up with a planning solution, which we do in planning. We always come up on a lot of theses of my colleagues are like tackling a challenge and then coming up with a solution, but my thesis was way more listening to the people and yeah, letting the end open.
So your thesis was based around looking into different ideas about this, but then also you did interviews with 8 women in the Westfjords, deemed innovative by some standard at least. Was there anything that they told you that surprised you or kind of made you reconsider what you had started up with?
So first of all, I found there was a big difference within I have to say I spoke just with 8 women, so I would say the next step would be to speak to so much more women. There are quite some women in the Westfjords who founded big companies and actually big economic enterprises. So yeah, talking with them about what they experienced, how their like way was, or their approach would be super interesting. So I don't have that, but besides that, I was actually pretty surprised that it is still very that women who grew up there and then they moved to bigger cities and they came back saying that it is actually still pretty traditional when it comes to gender roles, and that they didn't criticize that necessarily, just like telling me about that. I mean, they came back knowingly. They left and they came back knowingly. So it is, yeah, just I didn't expect it, especially because Iceland has this like international, yeah, it's seen as this like country with the smallest gender gap and stuff. So I was surprised to hear that, but I mean, yeah, it is personal experiences.
I think these things are also quite tricky because it's like when you ask a subject of a certain group whether that group is, drinks too much, what you're dealing with is whether they drink, how much they drink in that group, but also the perceptions of drinking.
Yeah.
So if you go into a place and everybody will tell you, the gender roles are completely fine, there is no difference between the possibilities women and men. What you might be experiencing also is the fact that there is no critique going on in that place.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to. I, for example, having moved from Reykjavik to the Westfjords and to a even smaller place than Ísafjörður,
Yeah.
I did not really experience any difference between those places in terms of social attitudes or value or like conservatism or anything like that. It wasn't like that cliche of the rural being more traditional. Totally my experience, of course, and also I'm a man, so who knows. But yeah, those are very difficult things to measure. But
yeah, and I mean it wasn't quantitative research that I did, but I can say I had like 3 groups of women, roughly, multiple groups, but when it comes to where they're from, it was kind of like 3 groups. We had a group of women who were born and raised in the Westfjords and never left. Then we had a group of women who were born and raised in the Westfjords, moved away for education, and then came back later to have a family there. And then we had the third group of women who were Icelanders, but from bigger cities and moved to the Westfjords. And the first and the last group, so the ones who were born there and never left, as well as the ones who were not from there but moved there, they did not perceive gender differences that harshly. So the one that grew up there said, this is like, she when she was describing situations, me as an outsider would say there is definitely a difference between the way you were treated and your husband was treated, but she didn't perceive that as unequal or unfair. And the person or the people who were born somewhere else but moved to the Westfjords, they perceived as like, no, I can do whatever I want, there's no social pressure. Whereas the people who were born there, moved away, experienced something else and came back maybe to the same place where the families are still living, they felt they pointed out that they realized the difference between men and women after experiencing something else in a bigger city. But that wasn't the focus of my research, and I just talked to 8 women, so that might be the focus of a future research.
Are you going to be working with these concepts in the future? What lies ahead for you, and can you incorporate these things that you've been looking into your current work?
Yeah, hopefully I can actually. While I was writing the thesis, I was like, I love the topic, but why did I choose it? I'm studying cities and sustainability. I have a background in environmental science and technology. I will not work with feminist theories or innovation at all, but I just got a new job. And I will be the sustainability manager of a smaller town in Germany, which in Germany means 30 or 40,000 inhabitants. That's not comparable to the Westfjords, but it is a smaller town. It is rural. It's not remote, but it's considered rural. So I hope that I can use this knowledge and these concepts of innovation and initiatives and especially also feminist theory in rural communities in my future work while engaging with citizens. So that will be exciting.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much first for sharing your thesis with me. There were certainly some things that are very interesting for us in this project of fostering innovation ecosystems in rural areas. Especially, I picked the stuff out of it that was interesting to me, which is this usually more around the concept of innovation and how it is defined and what are the consequences for how it's defined to what lens we put on it, on the rural and urban differences.
Yeah, I just remembered when you talk about fostering innovative ecosystems that there were two things that I realized, or what women were saying that they were kind of missing in these like ecosystems. That because there are in Iceland already quite some like workshops and also networks for women in innovation and women in enterprises, and but for the women in this like pretty remote communities, I mean, like my point of view from Germany is of course different, but they are kept or they're not connected to infrastructure for some days during the winter and such. Some women said that they actually benefited from the global pandemic because suddenly all these workshops and meetings were online.
Yeah.
Which I found that's actually something I found surprising, that this even within the Westfjords wasn't happening before, that these meetings were not offered online, because when you between these communities, even within the Westfjords, you might need 3 hours by car to get from one to get to Ísafjörður. So they said that's actually great. They don't have the time to travel a whole Saturday to Ísafjörður to join a meeting, and for them it's actually online so much more helpful. And I just lost the other thing that they were telling me, but nevertheless.
Absolutely. I mean, that's definitely a consequence, and I am actually we're working with 3 innovation initiatives in the south and the north and the Westfjords around creating like a digital platform to connect people who are working within food, energy and water.
Yeah.
And specifically we are doing it as an online platform because there's right now there's an initiative to create this science park in the center of Reykjavik, so
Okay.
very geographically concentrated, and like that's where the universities is, that's where the innovation, this and that, and the research development. So it's like 500 square meter, 500 meter radius, like really compact a lot of things physically, and definitely it's interesting when we start to think about it as digital networks, kind of become an equalizer for rural places. Because it is quite different. I mean, even like we talked about earlier, like small villages or rural places in Germany most likely are just an hour or 2 away from the next urban center.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's totally different from having to go like 5 or 6 hours, from a small city.
Yeah. Yeah, and then also a woman told me about the meeting times. They would be in the evenings where she would be being with the children and the family, having like family time. Would also not be suitable for them. But yeah, I hope. I mean, we've been working online now for like all of us globally for over a year, 1.5 years now, and I think a lot of us are tired of just being able to meet online and not in person. But I think we should also see the benefits for all of us, but especially certain groups that are not able to join. That were not able to join physical meetings before the pandemic, who are enjoying the benefits right now. So,
for sure.
Yeah.
We'll hope that some people will be able to watch this recording and learn from it.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks a lot for this.
Thank you. Super interesting talk.
I hope so. I hope it will benefit, and I hope you stay in touch, and we'll continue this chat in one way or another.
Definitely. I mean, I will follow your project in fostering innovations in the Westfjords, and I will stay, of course, in contact with the University Center and all the projects going on there. So
great. That's awesome.